In the early hours of the 30th of May 1993, a blues party was well underway in a disused warehouse in the Ashford Street of St Anne's. Among those who had been forewarned about the event was the Yardie Eaton Green. Mr. Green had fled to the UK to escape an attempted murder charge in Jamaica and to elude fellow Yardies who had scores to settle. By the age of 12, he had left school in downtown Kingston and was mixed in with gangsters who had affiliations with the PMP. They ran areas of the city with the help of corrupt politicians and policemen. By the time of the 1980s elections in Jamaica, the criminal gangs were emerging almost seamlessly. Mr. Green was at the vortex of it, now a gunman doing the bidding of corrupt PMP leaders who wanted to take down rivals working for the JLP. Mr. Green became part of the Tel Aviv crew, named after a slum in the area of Kingston where he was brought up. These were government housing projects built around yards, hence the name Yardie. The Tel Aviv crew was divided into a number of posses or gangs. This included the Rapid Posse, the Kremlin Posse and the Desert Posse, to which Green belonged to during the 1980s. Before the decade was over, he had been involved in a number of murders, which he would later confess to, spent 4 years in prison, and had been arrested for multiple crimes from murder to armed robbery. Reluctance on the part of the witnesses to come forward shielded him from several life sentences in Jamaica. In 1991, awaiting trial for a shooting, he jumped bail, booked a flight to the UK, and walked through immigration to begin what he hoped would be a new, prosperous life. Mr. Green was a dangerous man who was known to use a firearm at the slightest provocation. He became a frequent visitor to Nottingham from London and was soon known to the police. Nottinghamshire Police Intelligence picked up the information that Mr. Green was selling crack cocaine in the city. His name had cropped up in a few letters written by Ian Bedwood, which were seized by the police. In fact, Mr. Green was the only one of a small but growing number of Yardies branching out from the capital and selling drugs in major cities like Bristol, Manchester, Birmingham and Liverpool. According to testimony at a later court trial, two brothers from Birmingham who had recently fallen out with the Robinsons in an apparent turf rivalry were expected at a blues party which began on the night of the 29th of May. Police suspected these brothers were ferrying large amounts of cocaine into Nottingham. At a party 2 weeks earlier, two of the Robinson clan, Peter and Ricky, Dougie Mann's grandsons, had been severely beaten up. Another of the family, Leslie, who was working as a clerk at a law firm, would later become the main organiser for the Nottingham Afro-Caribbean Carnival. He had his car torched in an attack police believe was linked to the feud. Eaton Green, who had been partying at the Marcus Garvey Centre in Nottingham the same night with some Yardie friends, had also been dissed by some locals. One of them had saluted Asher's sound coming from the speakers with a volley of gunfire into the ceiling, which had almost deafened one of Mr. Green's associate, ROHAN "BUMPY" Thomas. And Bumpy wasn't happy about it at all. By 3:30 AM, Ashford's street party was in full swing, with around 200 punters enjoying heavy bass sounds from the booming speakers. Then chaos erupted. 5 men, one dressed in a bandana brandishing a Luger pistol, 2 others with handguns and another with a shotgun, burst into the building and switched on the lights. The music ground to a halt. The silence was broken by 2 blasts as the shotgun was fired into the ceiling by one of the raiders. Next, they began to strip customers of their money and jewellery. Their leader, Eaton Green, brandished his Luger in the face of a number of men who were present, taking interest in one in particular, Michael Johnson, who had refused to hand over anything and had made his dash to the exit. Mr. Green took aim and fired. The bullet missed Mr. Johnson and instead hit 20-year-old Liebert Bubbler Henry in the foot. 2 other men who refused to take this disrespect without a fight were beaten up by Mr. Green. "We are the Seek and Destroy posse, and this is a robbery," Mr. Green screamed at the terrified partygoers. Liebert Henry, blood pumping out of his damaged foot, pleaded to be let out the building and to get medical help, but Mr. Green refused, taunting them with the words, "Bleed, pussy, bleed." The gunmen had demanded that the men be separated from the women and began to remove jewellery, money, credit cards, mobile phones and drugs. The incident was over within half an hour, but in that time, Mr. Green and his gang robbed more people in one go than at any other recorded British crime. The Birmingham brothers that Mr. Green was looking for did not appear to be among the partygoers, but he evidently felt some part of his mission had been accomplished by robbing the locals and dissing them. At first, Operation Warehouse, as the police investigation was called, had only dug up a few leads to the gunman's identity, but gradually a picture began to emerge of some of the assailants. The main protagonist was a slim young black man in his late 20s with a large scar across his right cheek, wearing a bandana, and had answered the name Leon, which Nottinghamshire detectives knew from recent intelligence was Mr. Green's street name. Another man had the nickname Bumpy, according to some of the witnesses. The vehicle Mr. Green and his associates had driven from London was found to be a hire car booked from the company based at Heathrow Airport. CCTV images obtained from the company showed Mr. Green and two of his gang meeting ELAINE Robinson at Heathrow. Nevertheless, for Nottinghamshire police, the biggest revelation was yet to come. Over the subsequent weeks, officers began to piece together more information about Mr. Green. They found an address that he had been staying at, where there was further evidence of a connection to Nottingham. Photographs of ELAINE Robinson and her daughter Sophie, along with Mr. Green's mobile phone number. Information from Jamaican authorities revealed Mr. Green to be a very dangerous Yardie, wanted for the involvement of several brutal murders. How had he managed to slip into Britain without being arrested or turned back? In fact, as police in Nottingham were to discover, Mr. Green had been helped in avoiding deportation back to Jamaica. Not only that, he had brought two violent associates over from Jamaica on false passports with a little help from some friends in high places, friends specifically in the Metropolitan Police and the Immigration Service. Eaton Leonard Green was a top-level Yardie informant, playing a double agent role within the Metropolitan Police SO11 intelligence unit. His code name was Aldridge Clark. By July 1993, some resourceful Nottinghamshire detectives were closing in on Mr. Green, despite the lack of assistance from Scotland Yard. At around 2 PM on the 8th of July 1993, after tracking him through several addresses that they had gained from the social security details, they finally located their man walking down Mandela Road in Newham, East London. He was handcuffed and led to a car that would take him up the M1 to be questioned about the Blues Party robbery. But as Nottinghamshire officers were soon to discover, this was far from an open and shut case. The Metropolitan Police work ended up hampering the progress of their colleagues, perhaps on the basis that the ends justifies the means. Ultimately, the criminal trial would descend into chaos. As Nottinghamshire police began to question Mr. Green, a complex story began to unfold. Mr. Green said he had not been at the Blues Party, but could identify the assailant. He then told them to check in with a constable called Steve Barker at the Metropolitan Police's SO11 intelligence unit, and that all would be explained. Mr. Green insisted he was working for the Met and had become involved in gaining intelligence on the local drug scene, particularly as a man with the street name Pepsi had been relocated to Nottingham from London to sell crack. Pepsi was supposedly one of the leaders of the Tel Aviv crew based in Kingston, Jamaica. The Nottinghamshire detectives were highly skeptical. Nevertheless, they would have to check out the story before they could carry on with any questioning, particularly as the repercussions could prevent them from charging him for the offences he was being suspected of in Nottingham. What they began to uncover though, with a little help from the Met, was that Mr. Green and two other men believed to be involved in the robbery, ROHAN Colonel Bumpy Thomas and Cecile Thomas, were actively being shielded by Scotland Yard detectives because of their valuable information as informants. Indeed, Mr. Green had been deemed so important to the Yard that he was given an A-grade informant tag, denoting an agent whose information was prized at the highest level. He had his own code name to prevent his identification, a specialist hander who would meet him at pre-arranged secret locations to pay him and debrief him, and a 2-year history of providing top intelligence on Yardies, deprived inner city areas. He was, in fact, Scotland Yard's most prized asset in a battle against an unpredictable Yardie gangster. Perhaps the Met thought that Mr. Green was an asset worth sticking your neck out for, as they proceeded on a path that seemed to break the conventions of policing, justice and the law. The detectives from Nottinghamshire were unimpressed. The more they discovered about the nature of Mr. Green's relationship with their London counterpart, the more it strengthened their resolve to see Mr. Green put on trial for the robbery on their patch. They did not doubt that he had provided good information on the movement of firearms around the capital and the arrival of Yardies in London, but to turn a blind eye to an armed robbery of 150 out of 200 people at a party was not something they were prepared to do, or to justify to the victim. As far as they were concerned, Scotland Yard had effectively done nothing to help with Mr. Green's arrest after the robbery. Moreover, some individuals had effectively helped Mr. Green avoid arrest, not least his handler, who had met him during the weeks after the robbery and allowed him to walk away despite the Yard having been told by Nottinghamshire that he should be arrested. Detective Inspector Michael Leighton was among the senior Nottinghamshire police officers trying to track down Mr. Green and his accomplices. The team had been given full authority by their bosses to nail the gang, putting them on a collision course with Scotland Yard that would serve neither justice nor public. They were still in the dark about the extent of Mr. Green's role as an informant, even as they tried to solve the major case, and the economy of truth displayed by their fellow agencies was something they could never have predicted. Indeed, it would take the court case to flush out the truth. By July 1993, Mr. Green, along with ROHAN Thomas, Cecile Thomas, Stephen Crossdale and Errol Lynch, alleged to be the fourth and fifth members of the gang, had been charged with robbery. 3 Robinsons from Dougie Man's side of the family were also arrested, sisters ELAINE, Valerie and their brother Leslie. Detectives were convinced some of the Robinsons had played a role in sponsoring Mr. Green's gang to carry out crack cocaine business in the city and ultimately extract revenge on the 2 Birmingham brothers for humiliating members of the Robinson family. The 3 Robinsons were charged with conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm. Right up to the start of the trial at Leicester Crown Court, Scotland Yard concealed the importance of Mr. Green's role as one of their most prized agents. In October 1994, a few weeks after the trial opened, tactics that seemed almost Machiavellian were used to protect Mr. Green, who was pleading not guilty. At a first mitigation text, a method sometimes used by the police to tell the judge that the defendant has provided crucial information to help solve a crime and should be sentenced leniently, but without telling the barristers or jury, was received by the judge from the Metropolitan Police. It indicated that Mr. Green had been very helpful in the arrest of a number of cases and should be given credit with a reduced sentence should he be found guilty. Defence barristers tipped off about Mr. Green's role in the arrest and his co-defendants demanded the informant be identified. The prosecution barrister also indicated that senior officers from Scotland Yard were imploring him to abandon the trial. On the 14th of October, with the truth in danger of coming out, an officer went to the court to see the judge, Richard Pollard, and ask him not to reveal Mr. Green's identity. Faced with some unquestionable questions, the judge halted proceedings as a top-level discussion took place between Nottinghamshire Police, Scotland Yard, Barbara Mills, the Director of Public Prosecutions, and Sir Nicholas Liao, the Attorney General. Nottinghamshire Police were astounded to discover that Mr. Green had been given Met information about the weapon used in the robbery, who the assailants were, where they were holed up, and where some of the jewellery had been fenced. They also learned that the Met's intelligence report stated that all this information had been supposedly passed on to Nottinghamshire Police during the first few weeks of the investigation, which was news to them. It was suggested that there had been either an extreme breakdown in communication between the two forces, or that the Met was lying. The trial judge also felt that the Met had misled him and the CPS about Mr. Green's relationship with SO11, and that a senior Met officer had made inappropriate approaches to the judge and counsel in an attempt to get the trial thrown out. After battling the issue back and forth over a number of weeks, Director of Public Prosecutions and the Attorney General ruled that the Met were in the wrong. The role of Mr. Green would have to be revealed in court and the trials should continue. After a month away from the courtroom, however, Judge Pollard had no option but to discharge the original jury and call for a retrial. The defendants were remanded in custody. Faced with nowhere to hide, Mr. Green now changed his story once more and began to admit to a catalogue of crimes in Jamaica. 11 murders, as well as robberies, shootings and cocaine deals whilst in London on the payroll of Scotland Yard. He described in graphic detail to the Metropolitan Police officers how he had murdered on behalf of senior PNP politicians 3 Yardies suspected of snitching to the Jamaican authorities. He went on to explain how he was spotted carrying out the killing by a passing taxi driver, and so he executed him too, along with his passenger. Crucially, he was prepared to plead guilty to the robbery in Nottingham. By the time the case had came to retrial in June 1995, again at Leicester Crown Court, Mr. Green had already pleaded guilty and had been sentenced to 6 years in prison. A new trial judge, Mr. Justice Smedley, fully aware of what his counterpart Judge Pollard had been put through during the original trial, had some choice of words to describe the conduct of the Metropolitan Police. I am very disturbed at the way in which those responsible for handling Mr. Green as an informant appear not only to have failed to cooperate, but possibly have impeded inquiries that causes me alarm. Meanwhile, SO11 had given Mr. Green a new identity and placed him in witness protection on a prison wing in Parkhurst Prison on the Isle of Wight. It was an area reserved for just a handful of supergrasses, including Darren Nichols, the main witness in the 1998 Essex Range Rover murders, fictionalised in the Essex Boys film. Met clearly still believed Mr. Green could be of use to them if he went back to Jamaica. The retrial jury was told the events at Ashforth Street warehouse were like a Hollywood-style robbery. Barristers for the Robinson trio argued forcibly that their clients knew of no bad blood between them and the two Birmingham brothers, and that the gang was simply doing what all Yardie gangs do at blues nights: rob fellow partygoers. By the end of the retrial, the jury was unconvinced that any of the Robinson family had been involved in a conspiracy to commit violence against anyone at the party, though it was clear from CCTV images at Heathrow that ELAINE Robinson knew Mr. Green well, and that a phone linked to her sister, Valerie, had been used to contact Mr. Green right up until the minute the robbery was taking place. All the Robinsons were cleared of the GBH conspiracy charge. The alleged gang members did not fare so well. ROHAN Colonel Bumpy Thomas was convicted along with Stephen Crossdale. Cecile Thomas and Errol Lynch were cleared but deported back to Jamaica. Mr. Crossdale was eventually cleared on appeal, and Mr. Thomas, who had been faced with a 14-year sentence, had some of his convictions quashed as a result of an appeal, which ruled that Mr. Green's evidence could not be relied upon. Meanwhile, Hampshire's Police Chief Constable, Sir John Hoddinott, was given the role of carrying out a major inquiry into the Metropolitan Police handling of Eaton Green and another Yardie, DELROY Denton, who had murdered a woman while on their informant payroll. DELROY Denton was jailed for life in 1996 for killing Marcia Laws. The story of Mr. Green's recruitment emerged from 15,000 pages of evidence collected by Hampshire Police. The report, published in 1999, revealed just how far the authorities were prepared to go in allowing a gun-toting killer to help in a battle against the Yardies. Mr. Green had arrived on British soil in February 1991 and quickly immersed himself in the Yardie hotspots of Brixton and Hackney, where he found former associates from Jamaica doing roaring trade in the crack cocaine business and robberies. By the 21st of May, he had been arrested for traffic offences by a young constable, Stephen Barker. Following a 1 AM chat with Mr. Barker in Brixton Police Station, Mr. Green took the only available option to avoid extradition back to Jamaica. He turned into a grass. Over the next 2 years, he was able to provide detailed information to Mr. Barker of murders and robberies in London, New York and Jamaica, the traffic of cocaine and firearms into the UK, and the movement of Yardies through immigration desks in the UK and the United States. He was paid up to £1,000 a time for the 170 detailed reports that he gave to Mr. Barker. Through their sheer scale meant that they were able to rarely rely on the resources to act upon them. But all this time, Mr. Green was himself dealing in cocaine and robbing other dealers, with a firearm by his side almost everywhere that he went. Everybody carries a gun in Jamaica, so we do the same in England, he told detectives who would later question him. Sometimes we whip it out and shoot up the roof. We're just saluting the music. During his time as an informant, Mr. Green was arrested on 3 separate occasions by other Metropolitan Police units for possessing crack cocaine, but each time his crimes were never reached to the court until the audacious robbery in Nottingham. He was allowed to bring his own associates into the UK, including Rohan Thomas, who had served 14 years in Jamaican prison for shooting a policeman, and Cecile Thomas, another Yardie. Both came in on false passports despite the fact it was known by both Metropolitan Police officers and immigration officials that they had violent past and were wanted by Jamaican authorities. Colonel Bumpy alone was believed to have been involved in around 10 murders. 2 weeks after the robbery in Nottingham, and despite knowing he was on the run from their Nottinghamshire colleagues, the Met's SO11 unit sanctioned a visit by Mr. Green to Holland, where he was promptly robbed by some local dealers at gunpoint with an Uzi submachine gun pistol. Later, Steve Barker, after specifically being asked by Nottinghamshire officers and agreeing to help find Mr. Green, had met the fugitive. Whatever was said during the meeting, Mr. Barker did not arrest his informant and had allowed him to walk off. Sir John's report, which went to the Crown Prosecution Service, stopped short of recommending criminal charges being brought against police and the immigration officers involved in handling the Yardie informers, including Mr. Green, even though there seemed to have been a possible breach of the Immigration Act. To prove a misconduct charge, deliberate failure or willful neglect would have to have been shown. What did result from the report, however, were the sweeping changes in which informants were being handled by all law enforcement agencies. The recommendations resulted in a new regulation of the Investigatory Powers Act, RIPA of 2000, which specifies a large number of rules to be followed during the handling of a human covert resources. Not least, those recruiting informants should be kept away from those handling informants, and that the informants themselves would have to sign a far-reaching contract which laid them open to prosecution if it was not followed. It would inevitably mean that Mr. Green's episode would be harder to repeat, but it would also mean fewer officers being able to recruit fewer informants. Ultimately, the intelligence which had been pouring in on those fighting to keep drugs and firearms off the street would often come only from criminals hoping to take competitors and opponents out the game. Officers became reluctant to handle informants, fearing they could be prosecuted themselves if snitches ran riot, as Eaton Green had done. By 1997, Mr. Green, still in his cell on the Isle of Wight, was fighting a deportation application from Nottinghamshire police. He was already 18 months past the time when he could have been freed from his 6-year sentence, but found the cell walls at Parkhurst even more inviting than the freedom of the streets. His lawyer argued that a very senior police officer from the Met had promised Mr. Green, his wife, a British citizen, and his mother protection for the rest of his life, and that if he was sent back to Jamaica, it would be sending him to a certain death, as his status as an informant was well known due to media coverage of his case. This time, the Home Office was not prepared to play ball with Mr. Green, and the Home Secretary, Jack Straw, took the personal decision to rubber stamp the deportation order. Mr. Green was sent back to Kingston a few months later. John Grieve, the head of SO11 team that handled Mr. Green, seemed unfazed. He did, however, apologise for not sending Nottinghamshire the right information at the right format at the right time. He told reporters Mr. Green was well worth the investment. It is extremely unfortunate and to the detriment of the people of London that we no longer have him. Nottinghamshire's police head of CID, Philip Davis, took a different view. Informants are essential, he said. However, there is to be a stringent guideline and procedures which must be observed in the integrity of the system if it is to be maintained. No doubt his officers wouldn't disagree with the sentiments of using informants like Mr. Green in an ongoing battle against seemingly impenetrable problems such as Yardie gangs. After all, they have used many such informants themselves. In February 2006, a man whose identity they protected as a witness in a murder case, Trinidadian TREVON Thomas, shot and seriously injured one of their own officers, Rachel Baum, as she investigated a burglary in Lenton. What angered Nottinghamshire police was that their Scotland Yard counterparts had failed to control their source, and then, when presented with an unpalatable truth, tried to protect his identity and had stalled their work to arrest him by withholding information. The fallout led to poor relations between the two forces for years. It also led to tensions between local police and the victims of the Blue Party robbery, who felt that Nottinghamshire and the Met were using the black community as pawns in a game against each other. For Eaton Green, it was to be, predictably, perhaps a short-lived existence in Jamaica. On the 20th of April 2005, police were directed to his Mitsubishi car close to a central sorting office in Kingston. In the boot they found Mr. Green's body, wrapped up and riddled with 5 bullets, signifying a Yardie execution. Mr. Green had been lured from his Craigtown home along with 2 other men, who were also shot dead. It seems that Mr. Green, who had been back for more than 3 years, had carried on with his trigger-happy exploits. Police suspected him of a number of crimes, including the murder of a young woman who was found dumped at Constitution Hill the previous year. Mr. Green was the 508th murder victim of Jamaica in that year, and that was only 4 months into the year. He was 37, having passed the average lifespan of a Yardie criminal by some 5 years. The scale of the death toll demonstrated just how cheap life was in Jamaica. The ripple effect seen in Britain with Yardies like Mr. Green and his associate carried on with a cut price attitude towards life. By the turn of the century, black on black violence had become an everyday occurrence in Nottingham, London, Bristol, Manchester and Birmingham. The difference was the crimes were being committed by a new generation of criminals, so-called homeboys, born and bred into British life, who were now setting up their own posses, rapping in patois, dripping in gold jewellery and carrying very big guns.